welcome to another very exciting episode of Detection and Engineering Dispatch. We are joined with a very special and esteemed guest who you may remember from one of our previous episodes, Kevin Zook. He's from our Anvilogic Forge, our in-house team, who again researches the threat landscape. They replicate a lot of their threat behaviors in the lab, and they're cooking up all kinds of detections, right, to populate our Forge armory with the latest and greatest. And a lot of these are, out in production today by many of our customers. I am Alex. I'm hosting your Detection Dispatch content consisting of all things related to DE topics, hot topics, discussions, use cases, and today a workshop, which is what you're going to be getting as promised. Kevin has put together a really great workshop on how to present cybersecurity findings, how to communicate threat analysis, right? How to report to your leadership all the great, all the great things that you've uncovered in the organization. So if you enjoy our content and you want to stay in the loop, please subscribe to our email list, right? And join us right here live bi-weekly, or you can catch the replays on our YouTube channel. So Kevin, I'll just let you take it away.
Okay, so we've already gone over what the topic is. The goals of this are basically to show you a repeatable and scalable investigation and documentation process. I've used it hundreds of times in my career, and it's helped me kind of stay on the rails and make sure that I'm getting all the information I need to the recipient. So there's also other parts of managing this whole process, including talking with stakeholders and managing a team potentially. Those will be discussed as well in here. And at the end, we're going to have a quick lab, just a couple questions based on what was in the presentation. So just to start, why you should listen to me. I've worked in a bunch of different roles, internal SOC, which is just the, police work, day-to-day incidents that you would work at a large company. I've worked on internal IR teams, and I've also worked at a bunch of different companies on the services side as well, which is finding things in customer data and then telling them about it. So I've written tons and tons of reports, and since I've done it hundreds of times, I've learned a lot of stuff along the way that I would like to share with you. For new analysts, again, it's just a repeatable process that you can use some stuff from it if you want and tweak it to your liking. I'm going to show you how I've used it, and you can do whatever you want with it. For more experienced analysts, I hope I can just give you some tips at least that'll improve your report writing process if you have one. So let's keep going. Why would you write a report? You write reports basically to get the recipient to do something related to their security posture. Some kind of change needs to be made in order for things to be more secure. You have to really pay attention to who your audience is, because it's going to drive what they want from you. And the type of actions they do, you're going to want to tailor what you're telling them to what action they're going to perform. So your reporting is going to increase the client's understanding of the incident and their larger security posture. So usually an incident has a way that an attacker got onto the network. A lot of the time that needs to be remediated somehow, either through policy changes or changes to EDR tools or something like that. So when you write these reports, you tell them what you found, what you think they need to do to make their network better, and then hopefully they implement. You do these through remediation instructions and recommendations, typically at the end of any report you write. There is so-called informational reporting out there that I'm not a huge fan of. It's kind of just reports that are sent, typically automated, and it's just things that, maybe look strange or aren't a smoking gun, where there's no action assigned to it. I'm not a huge fan of those types of reports, because typically the people that read them will get tired of reading them and stop looking. And if there's no action, the question of why are you writing this and sending it to a client is probably a pretty good one, or a client or an internal team. So here's a bunch of different audiences there are when you're writing reports. If you're on an internal team, sometimes you will be writing reports to the people that will do reimages of machines and AV scans and stuff like that, just a desktop support type staff. And what they're going to want from you is what you want them to do to make things back to normal. They typically only look at one host that you send them, usually an alert. They're going to want to know why they're doing what they're doing and what the risks are if they don't do it. I usually include those because they're typically pretty bad. If a machine's not reimaged after there's malware, the results of leaving that on the network are usually that's something you don't want to do. So I usually state what I found, why it's bad, and hopefully they see the criticality is high enough to take action. They're not going to care as much about the technical details or the timelines because they're just going to install a new operating system build to restore it to normal. The next type of audience is security staff. And these are more technical folks, usually an IR team or a SOC, and they're going to want to know what you found they haven't typically. Because if you're just augmenting a security team, they're probably going to be running an investigation alongside yours. And that's something you're going to want to help with. And they're probably going to trust their analysis more than yours. So if you can contribute something that they haven't found, that's really valuable. Almost everything is important. They're going to want to know all the details. They're detail-oriented people usually. They're going to care less about the high-level summary because they're going to be down in the details and already know quite a bit about the incident by the time you're writing something to them. And I'm saying this line for customers we have that are part of MSSPs. Typically, those are, well, actually, that's for the external, the next one. If you're writing to an external customer, what they want from you, you're going to have to kind of gauge. I've worked with customers from, very basic, just an IT team with a couple people on it to a full, instant response organization that I'm just helping. It really depends. And they'll often tell you what they want as well. Upper management, you'll probably only do this a couple times in your career, or at least once a year, probably at the most. These are the really big incidents you work. They take a couple weeks, usually involve everybody on the team. And what they want is they're going to want to know how the network was impacted, what was taken, and what's going to be done about it so it doesn't happen again. And you're going to want to be brief with upper management, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you can communicate to them more effectively. Any questions so far, by the way? Am I doing on time?
Yeah, we have one in the chat. Really good one. The one that we just talked about, Kevin. And it's, do you think that we can get all of these reports via ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, at least the templates, and then just modify further once, as needed?
Sure. With any AI thing, you can give it instructions. The level to which it completes your instructions to your satisfaction is going to vary heavily. So even if you do use ChatGPT or any, LLM to write reports, you're still going to have to do a lot of the checking and stuff. And it's quite frankly, a lot of time it's not right as well. So you're going to want to understand what you're seeing, at least to just validate what ChatGPT is saying. Without it, you're kind of flying blind. So it's possible, yes, but your results are going to vary. Does that help?
Yeah, I would add some color as to, these like Copilot and Gemini, they're not going to have a lot of the security expertise, like the context, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 level context of how one should go about remediation. And these are like some of the things, as Kevin covered, to include in your report. So all of that is expert knowledge that you bring as a security, practitioner to your report writing that I highly doubt ChatGPT is gonna do. I would say once you get that out, like that knowledge out, just use ChatGPT to get the grammar right.
Okay, so keep going here. What you're going to want to find early in your investigation, earliest time of compromise is very important. Typically, you can find this just by if you think you're done and you take every log you have and sort in descending order, the first host that comes up. What you're going to want to gauge from that is what happened on the first host you see indicative of somebody getting onto the network, or is it more like you're watching somebody that's already been there? Or do you not know? Because a lot of the times you will have a first host, but you won't know if it's patient 0 because maybe the detection for it is just something like, malware detected. It's the first detection. So they had to have been there first, but we don't know if there's anything that came before that we've missed, maybe because of visibility or what have you. So like if you have a host that looks like it's just out of nowhere something bad happened, it's a very strong possibility that it is not patient zero. If you have well, I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Patient zero is the first host that was compromised. Knowing patient zero and having a reason how they got on there, like for example, if the first thing that was found is a web shell, or the first thing that is found is a SQL injection, then chances are you probably do have patient zero, because those are ways of getting onto your network from an external network. But if, like I said, if all you have is a suspicious process detection, a suspicious file detection, it's very possible you don't have it, and it's probably not a good idea to mention it as such. And it's probably a good idea to look to see if you can find something earlier, because a lot of the times you're missing it. Initial method of ingress is what I was talking about before, where if there's a web shell, if there's a SQL injection or a phishing email that delivered malware, that's the initial method of ingress. And that's what you're going to want to key in on when you're writing recommendations, because you're going to want to prevent that from happening again. So, for example, in the web shell example, you're going to want to see how they got the web shell on there. It's usually a vulnerability, and patch it. If it's a SQL injection, you're going to want to figure out how that command was relayed to the SQL server through a web application and get rid of whatever code there is for that. If it's a phishing email, you might want to have, user education. That type of remediation work, that's mentioned at the end, but we'll cover that in a bit. These are heavily sought pieces of information. They should always be in the findings section and executive summary section that I'll go over very soon. So there's typically 3 types of reports that I've very loosely been tasked to write before. The quick report, which is basically like if you have an AV detection on a host or just a one-off process detection for malware, something like that, and you look at that one host's all their events, you find all the bad stuff and you relay that. That's the most common type of report. I usually write them once a day or at least a few times a week for our various customers. And for these, you don't really there's not a lot of deliverables. There's your analysis, which you do on your own, and then you communicate findings and recommendations, and the customer follows them. That's it. And the reason for that is you write these so many times that, there's no reason to do a deep dive analysis on them. The host needs to be reimaged. It was a one-off detection. And if the host is reimaged, the network will be brought back to normal. The next is kind of a multi-host incident, where that necessarily means you probably have lateral movement or at least a bunch of detections that are similar on multiple hosts. And for these, the goal is to really find out how that happened quickly, because you don't want them to spread to more machines. So figure out what mechanism they use to get, between different hosts on the network and shut that off as quickly as possible, whether it's isolating the hosts or maybe blacklisting the file in EDR or both. A bunch of different things can be done. But the goal is to find a solution quickly and basically contain everything quickly. Sorry.
Evan, I was going to just say, as an example, like the log4j, that would have been a full-fledged incident report, like completely. But maybe something like, I don't know, like something not as critical. Would you say that makes sense for like a quick report?
Quick report, yeah, just a one-off detection on a host, a detection that's not on any other hosts, or two max. Especially if you can ensure that the way that they got on both hosts were isolated. It wasn't the same thing. There was no lateral movement. Maybe they visited the same site or something and got malware. That's the type of thing it's for. But if there's as soon as lateral movement happens, it moves to a multi-host incident, I'd say. So the last one here is an incident response report, which I've written, maybe 10 total in my career. They're very exhaustive. They're finding every single host that was accessed or compromised, listing the accessed host, going through all the compromised hosts in a findings section, having an executive summary. Typically, the timeline itself is relayed as a deliverable just because of the amount of events that are detected that are related to it. And so it's very coordination heavy. Fortunately, this process that I'm going to show you, it works very well with multiple people. You can simply, like if you have 10 hosts and you have 2 other people, you can split the host between everybody. Everybody goes off in timelines, each one. and then you combine them at the end to make a narrative for your report. That's a very common way to do it, and it works very well. It scales very well. Okay, so timelining could probably be its own presentation altogether, but I'm going to start you off with just a real simple one. Timelining, if you're not giving the timeline to someone else as a deliverable, it's for you to write your report. So it's to organize your findings and your thoughts so that you don't forget anything as you write your report. And if you do this, it'll make your writing better. It just does, because a lot of people will get buried in logs during an incident, and they'll copy a bunch of them into, Sublime, and then say, I'll get back to it later, and then they don't. That's the type of thing you're going to want to avoid. You're going to want to record everything in this timeline so that you can reference it later, especially alongside everything else that happened in the incident. Once you have a bunch of like if you have 20 individual timelines and you combine them and then sort by descending order, you will learn a lot that is not obvious from looking at those 20 timelines individually. It really draws everything together. And sometimes it'll show you where stuff is missing as well. So basically, a lot of people underestimate the role of time just because there's a tendency to want to string match between logs to say that they're related, which works great when it works, but it doesn't always work. Sometimes two things happen at almost the same time, and the only way you know they're related is because of that time. Like, you learn something new, and then you learn how those logs are related, and then you can take that and move on to the next incident with it. That's how I've learned almost everything I know about, the Windows operating system, how processes and files and stuff like that work. Just doing this over and over and over and over. As I said before, they scale easily between one host or multiple hosts, multiple people. All you got to do is split up the work and then combine everybody's timelines at the end. So let's go on to the next slide. What am I doing? Okay. So here, we were talking before about ChatGPT or LLMs and how they can write reports and stuff. Here's one thing that they get wrong often, and it's something you're going to want to check. So this is a bunch of EDR detections. You would commonly see them, on a customer network or maybe an internal network if you're an internal SOC that has an EDR tool deployed. And the nuance around what these various detections mean is sometimes poorly understood, and certainly poorly understood by LLMs in some cases. So if you have a file that's deleted, for example, a lot of times that comes from AV tools and stuff like that. And because it's simply detecting a file on disk, it could have been there for years, and it's just getting detected now. There's nothing immediate about these detections except that a scan was run and we found something bad and it matched some kind of pattern or matched a hash that was bad and it was seen on disk. These tend to be lower severity just because there will usually be a lot of other stuff, especially like processes and active things happening on the host. If it's truly compromised now, what you find with a lot of these are just old stuff, or sometimes you'll see a malware that keeps installing a component of itself and dropping a file, and the AV is unable to reach the thing that created the file. So what happens is it keeps showing up on disk. That's a pattern you'll often see. Sometimes it'll delete it or move it to a quarantine. Basically the same thing. What you do want to pay attention to is if they resurface, though. And if you're working a large incident, sometimes it can hint as to what other files an attacker may have used, especially if they use what are called staging directories, which are basically directories that a person uses across multiple machines just for ease of use. And that's the way they're used to using them. It can hint at that stuff, but oftentimes these are lower confidence. Okay, next comes file write block. And these are usually higher than malicious file deleted because it usually involves a process that's running and actively trying to write a file, and it doesn't like the file that the process is trying to write. In this case, it's kind of it's more serious because there's something actively running on the system at the time of detection, unlike the first example. So you're going to want to pay really close attention to the process that wrote it. If it maps to a file on disk that's not a system process, it's a process it's a file that an attacker wrote, you're going to want to pay attention to anything that happened around the same time on the host that file was written. So next one, malicious file detect is very close to deleted, but if it's unable to action it, Sometimes that's because there's a handle to the file or the malware is actively able to avoid being removed somehow. So it's a little bit worse usually. Some EDR products will have a field that, well, most will, that say what it did with the detection. If you have something like a malicious file detected and then there's an action of none, or there's no indication that something was done with it, it's probably still on disk, and that makes it worse. So next, malicious process detected. You're going to want to, again, very similar to before, find when that was written on disk and figure out what happened around it, what files are around it, because they're likely to be malicious and related. I put that in there on twice on accident. Whoops. What was malicious process detected here supposed to be? Whoops, sorry. I guess I just accidentally put an extra malicious process detected. It should be high, and it should be, in addition to the process itself, the parent and surrounding events on disk should be looked at. So if it was written to the temp folder or something, figure out what time it was written, timeline the host, look around the same time, look on disk if you have access to disk to see what else was written or what else was happening at the same time.
Hey, Kev,
Yep.
I want to share while we're on the topic of EDR detections, something that in a past life was really helpful to share in particular process executions, and how to report on them. And we use this thing called the 3x4 methodology. And we look at the executable in question, the suspicious one, and we look at three elements, right? And we compare across each three element four things. That's why it's called the 3x4. And so the first thing we do, we look at the process, right? The executable. What was the parent process of that? And what was the child process that if a child one opened? And so for these three processes, we compare four characteristics of these things. And so let me see if it would probably be helpful to whiteboard it. But so out of these four things, right, we look at, did the process connect, have like any network connections, right? Did it connect to anything? Look for any outbound connections that it may have taken to the IP and to what port. Then the next thing that we looked at is the certificate. So was it a valid certificate from a legitimate entity that signs their certificate, and is that certificate expired? That's the second and third one. And then the fourth one is, what is that process behaving like? And that is like, did it launch, another one? Is it doing something that you don't typically, have seen it done in the past? And you look at those four things across the three elements, right? So 3x4, you end up checking 12 things essentially. And it's a pretty quick process once you like get into the habit of things. And it works like kind of like a traffic light signal. If one of those characteristics are malicious, it's a red light. Like, we should probably like look more into it. But that's kind of a framework that I just thought about as you were talking about this.
Yep, those are all useful things to do for sure, and useful for triage. Last one I have here is, if EDR is able to terminate a process or stop it from starting, then it's partially mitigated, but you're still going to want to figure out why, or what caused that, and if it's still running, why it was trying to create another process that was malicious. Next, so executive summaries. I've only written a few of these, but when I have written them, they really matter because they were going off to somebody that, like a CISO or a CIO, that is going to make decisions based on the report, and their understanding of what you write is basically going to be their main understanding of what happened on their network. So you really have to make sure you get it right. So they're usually for huge reports. So every time I've written an executive summary, it was usually a multi-week incident at the very least, with multiple people on it. And basically, the level at which you can distill your technical knowledge into a statement of impact is basically, that's how well your executive summary is going to do. So you're going to want to let them know how their business was impacted by the incident. You're going to want to include the earliest time of compromise and latest time. And you're going to want to say when you stopped analyzing as well, just in case something else happens after. Or if new stuff is found, they're going to want to compare it to your report to make sure that it was in your analysis window. You're going to want to include the number of hosts accessed and compromised. Accessed hosts are just hosts that were touched by the attacker. Like, for example, if they did a directory listing on 200 hosts, you may want to list them, but you don't want to talk about each and every one. The hosts you do want to talk about are the ones that were compromised, meaning the attacker did something on it that was different than all the other hosts and showed that they were controlling the system. So patient zero is a good candidate for compromised always, because by definition they'd been compromised. But attackers will usually start at patient zero and either choose a mothership that they want to use, like a domain controller, or a host that is accessed by a whole bunch of different ones, typically a server, and they will fan out from that. Or sometimes they just fan out from patient zero. They'll try to move laterally around the network immediately to maybe try to get to a domain controller and dump creds immediately. You're going to want to include anything that involves data loss. That's extremely important. That's the main thing they're worried about. That intellectual property can take a ton of time and money to obtain. So if it goes out the door, the CISO or CIO is going to want to know about it. So next section is findings, and it's the main section of your report. It's going to be the longest by far. And it's basically a bunch of mini reports put together and described in words and then sorted in descending order. That's all findings is. So again, you're going to only want to write paragraphs for hosts that have new and interesting activity on them, something that sets it apart from the other ones. If it's just if the only activity is something that happened on 100 other hosts, mention it once and then don't keep talking about it after, because it's not going to be the main thing. It's not going to be on the main path, so to speak. It's just going to be part of recon or something like that. Also, like if an attacker deploys ransomware to a whole bunch of hosts, you'll want to list the hosts, but there's nothing new that's on each one. They'll all be instructed to go to some kind of internal share and download and execute, and that's it. So in a scenario like that, you're just going to want to list the hosts. Again, it should always be in descending order, starting with patient zero, or the first host that you have that you don't know whether it's patient zero or not. You're going to want to start there, obviously. So you're going to want to list accessed hosts, a paragraph for each compromised host, several paragraphs related to patient zero. Typically, the first box that the attacker's on, they will show their hand heavily. They'll try different stuff. They'll probe on the network, and they'll kind of give you an idea of what they're thinking next. If there's data loss, you're going to want that at the end and talk about it for multiple paragraphs because it's very important. So here's how to start a findings section or a paragraph in a findings section. For a small report, you're just going to want to start with on and then the earliest detection time. You're going to want to state the time zone it's in. Typically, it's UTC if all your logs are normalized. But if you have like forensic data, you might need to normalize it, but if you're doing that, you probably know that by now. You want to include the host name in the first sentence. For a larger report, you're going to want to talk about hosts in the aggregate, and you're just going to simply go down time-wise, descending order, and describe everything that's in your timeline, removing anything that's happened a bunch of times on every single host and emphasizing the things that only happened once. So the larger report there, that's kind of what that would look like. That's how it would start. And again, the report is going to be as large as the number of hosts that had interesting things happen on them. So if you have 5 hosts that they actively compromised and were doing stuff from, you're going to have 5 to 10 paragraphs, and plus 1 paragraph for what data loss. You're going to want to starting paragraph, bonus paragraphs, I guess, on patient zero. Okay, so here's some tips and common pitfalls with findings. Some people will try to make logs say stuff that they don't, just because they have an opinion about what happened, but it's never actually explicitly said anywhere. I would say avoid stating what you think happened. Just stick to what did happen. Because if you get a question, like you're gonna have to potentially defend what you found. And if you don't have a piece of evidence that points to something you state, that doesn't look good. So only stick to the facts unless you're very, 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 very sure. It's good practice to report the time zone, ensure the logs are normalized. typically the way people get in trouble with this is if they have a bunch of logs from a logging platform and then they do forensics on a bunch of different hosts that are in different time zones, all of that needs to be normalized so it makes sense in your final timeline and by extension your final report. Avoid the pointless repetition. If it happened on each host, make sure you defang any links. So make sure any links you have aren't clickable, especially if they're malicious. You can, space out the periods in there so it doesn't pick those up. Surround them by brackets and stuff like that. And change the protocol. Instead of HTTP, use HXXP. I personally like to bold file paths, URLs, users, and host names to draw attention to them. At the end, you're going to want to figure out, ultimately, your goal is to figure out kind of what the business impact was potentially of the incident and state what that is. So that means, in this case, or most cases, means data loss. Obviously, there's compromised hosts. That's business impact as well. Servers that are application servers that are impacted, those are probably going to need to be reimaged and stood back up. That takes time and effort. All that's business impact, and you're going to make sure you're going to want to state that because that's basically the whole point of what you just did. So when you have data loss, you're going to want to be very, very specific about it. Like, when was it taken? How many rows is it? What type of data elements are present in it? What's the volume of data in megabytes? What host was it taken from? That type of stuff. That's very, very important. And if you don't include that, you'll probably just get questions on it because that's what everybody wants to know.
Just wanted to stress that can be the make and break factor between like when to get authorities involved. That's going to be key, what they're going to literally go first thing they find. Just wanted to take a pause here. There's some questions in the chat.
Okay.
Around the particular history. And let me know if I'm saying this correct, Mahesh, unless you want to talk live. But he's saying that oftentimes, like a lot of EDR tools like CrowdStrike, Defender, right, etc., they don't really share the history of like how effective the detection triggered, right? And so when writing a report, I think he's saying that it's important to factor kind of like the rule history of it. He said he's never seen EDR, like the EDR history be taken into account. So should like the alert and like how the alert was kind of made, and if there was history on the alert itself, should that be included in the report?
Yeah, most important history is you're gonna want to find the first thing that's related to this attack and start with that. So any host that's compromised, look as far back as you think it may have gone. If you want to pad a month on it, fine, but always start with the first thing you found. So if the first event you're reporting is the first thing that happened as part of the incident, then history is not super important because we only want to talk about what happened during the incident. I don't know if that answers your question, but does it answer your question, I guess?
Let's see if he responds.
Yes, Kevin.
Yep.
You rightly said. I was talking that once I'm going to using EDR and specific tools like CrowdStrike or Defender.
Yep.
The problem right now is I want to know the case study and built on the report, like what was the history. Suppose I'm just going to investigation log4j attack, like pay on any specific systems.
Yep.
So EDR is not, the detection is showing it, but it will not showing the case study and also the use cases, like what was happened, what was the root cause, what it has happened, and what was the problem statement was there.
Right.
Yeah.
So with EDR, sometimes it feels like with EDR detections, like there's missing information. You just got to work with incomplete information a lot of the time. So if there's no history, or a lot of times the first thing you see it seems like it's part of a process, but the process, the thing that's found is in the middle of the process. You're often just left with no other context. In cases like that, just report what you see. If there's no if there's no history you have, and by the way, with like logic, you're saying you don't see the logic of the alert or the use case. A lot of the times for EDR companies, that's their secret sauce. So they don't necessarily want to tell you that because that's what they're selling you. So I'm not surprised that they often don't give you a whole lot of context. They just give you an alert name, the process that it was found, maybe hashes and stuff, but that's it. We get stuff like that all the time. And with incomplete information, just report what you see.
And oftentimes, I mean, if it's even available at all, because maybe alerts are available for you forever, but like if you want to actually get raw telemetry, there's only so much you can look back on because of retention policies typically being 90 days, sometimes 30, CrowdStrike 7. So if you want to look back beyond 7 days, and you're not keeping that anywhere, that becomes an issue. And maybe it's off somewhere and you need to rehydrate it or however the case may be. That's why it's really important to collect that information.
I hope that was something. Okay, so these points here are important enough to state at both the start and the end of the report. So do so. And make sure you include a cutoff time. The last section is recommendations. This is where you give the remediation instructions. I have a list of stuff you can very easily use to create recommendations based on your findings. By the time I finish my findings section, I already know what the recommendations are going to be because they're very simple. But it's very important you do it right as well. And remember, when you're giving any recommendation, you should consider business impact. So it would be a bad idea to say reimage an application server, for example, because it was accessed. Because the business impact you're going to create from reimaging that server is going to be greater than the security impact. If you can prove that the only thing that was done is a file listing on a web server, I would probably say that it's not, it's not a good idea to reimage it. As long as you can prove that it's not compromised from outside and it's just an accessed host, be very careful about what you say to reimage. But what you do want to say is anything that's compromised, definitely reimage it, even if it's on the perimeter, because it's a way an attacker can get onto the network and it's a huge security risk at that point. So you're going to want to also figure out how patient 0 was compromised. So if it was a web server and they got in through a web shell, figure out how they were able to execute code on that machine, usually some kind of web server vulnerability, and make sure when that application server is brought back online that the vulnerability isn't present, or what will happen is another attacker could come through it, or the same one. So don't just say restore stuff to a known good build. Say this application needs to be investigated as to how they got on there and what you can do to make sure they don't again. So usually, sometimes SQL, sometimes web shell. Those are really common ones. So here's some generic recommendations you can make with generic cases. So if a host is compromised, i.e., an attacker did something on it that was more than just touching it, accessing it, it should be reimaged. Now, sometimes customers will come back to you, a customer or an internal customer will come back to you and say, do we really have to reimage this? In that case, I would say to them, reimaging is what we recommend because it restores stuff to something that's known good. If you keep this online, you're accepting some risk because we don't know everything that was done on it potentially. So if they ask you, I would say still reimage it, but if you have to keep it online, here's the risks. If you have a user account that's doing a lot of malicious stuff, especially across multiple hosts, there's no harm in locking their account quickly and then talking to them, because that can potentially contain an attack if that's the only user account they have access to. It might prevent their ability to move laterally as well if it's an AD account. If a server is compromised, again, you're going to want to state what happened on the server, but the recipient of whatever of your analysis is going to have to decide whether it's worth reimaging that host based on what happened or not. If there is a complete domain compromise, like the attacker demonstrates that they have access to a domain admin account and they're doing stuff from it, what you're going to want to do is wait until they're kicked out. But when they are, you're going to want to reset everyone's password. So if they get on the network again, they're going to have to find a way to dump credentials again. They can't just reuse an account that they already know about with a password they already know. And this is just a Band-Aid, really. And you'll know very quickly if they still have access because they'll show up in the same alerts you've been getting if you figured out that the domain is compromised. Just generically, if you have a compromise that involves single factor auth, tell them to implement two-factor. I've seen many cases where, for example, a network will get compromised and then they'll try to come back with single factor authentication, but since two-factor was added, they'll get the password right, but they won't get the two-factor right because they don't have the token. That can be that's basically the best thing that can happen. If the way they got in was through single factor, they try to come back and they're blocked from that, you seriously did damage to their ability to get back on the network. I guess that's it. We do have a challenge. It's just a couple questions based on this presentation about various parts of the analysis and documentation process. And I think Alex, do you have the link for that?
Yep. Let me paste it here in the chat. Please go to this link. It'll be a folder with 2 files. Let me know if you're having access issues, but it should have been, the permission should have been enabled so that anybody with the link could access. And you should see an Excel spreadsheet and then just a binary text file. Awesome.
And what you have, like that timeline, it's really shorthand. But if you can use that format, for a regular incident, if you want, feel free to add and remove columns as needed. We talked about parent process earlier. That's a column I left out, but if you have a bunch of log data, feel free to include it in your timeline. It might show you something that you might not otherwise get out of it. And it's really up to you. Unless you're giving somebody the timeline is for you to understand the incident and then transcribe what happened. There should be a spreadsheet, just a couple log lines in there that I made up just for the purposes of, this exercise. And 3 questions and answers.
All right. You have a favorite report you've ever written about that you want to share?
No, I would have to redact a bunch of client stuff from it. So I thought about doing something like that, but good enough.
I have one. I'll share it. Look at the door element. And based on the report findings, it shows like the equivalent portions of what each attack vector took up. Because get it, that's how they get in initial entry. Isn't that so fun? Not only that, they're reinventing report writing. If you take a look at the notes, the footnotes here, if this is the future of cybersecurity writing, I'm here for it. This says an incredible L for XXX. Unless we now have successfully ripped them out of our networks, we're back to our smoke signals and carrier pigeon ways. This is so funny. So props to the future of cybersecurity writing. And if you haven't taken a look at the Verizon data breach investigation report, definitely do that. It has a lot of great information. All right, then if that is going to be all for today, Kevin, thank you so much for this really insightful workshop. I hope that everyone that participated in it enjoyed Kevin's content and guidance expertise from the field. He's doing this all the time, guys. So do let us know if there's any other topics that you want to see in our upcoming sessions. We've got some really fun things cooking up for our detection dispatch lineup. Next week, we're going to have Andrew Van Vliet. I know I keep saying that a lot, but we've had some scheduling conflicts, but now he's officially going to be here in 2 weeks. Talks a lot about threat hunting. So join us to talk about his philosophies and his guidance on detection engineering. And also we're going to be streaming some content live from GERCon and DEF CON. We'll have a lot of new presentations from Black Hat. So pretty event-packed season. So thank you so much for joining. Kevin, thank you so much. You're always an esteemed guest here on Dispatch.
Yep.
And I hope everyone have a really good rest of your summer and keep joining us here, spending some time with us every 2 weeks.
Thanks, everybody.
Life is crazy in detection engineering. It's true.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.